We haven't talked much about cryptocurrencies on this podcast. That's partly because a lot of people out there spend a lot of time talking about crypto, and it's hard to add much to that conversation. It's also because much of the time, there's not much to analyze. Cryptocurrencies go up and down in value, but they're essentially speculative assets. Once you strip away the technology, there's really little to get your teeth into. Stablecoins, however, are more interesting in my view. These are the digital tokens which, unlike pure cryptocurrencies, are pegged to financial assets, usually denominated in US dollars. Stablecoins like USDC are key parts of the crypto ecosystem, helping people trade and move money around. And several things have happened recently that make this topic worthy of examination. First, the US Congress has introduced a piece of legislation, the Genius Act, that attempts to regulate stablecoins. Second, Circle Internet Group, which is the creator and operator of USDC, is going public in the US. And the family of US President Donald Trump has jumped on the bandwagon, issuing a stablecoin called World Liberty Financial, which opens up a whole new array of conflicts of interest. So these developments raise several interesting questions. Are the US rules fit for purpose when it comes to regulating stablecoins? What are the risks for the broader financial system of bringing them inside the regulatory fence? And how will what is happening in the US affect the rest of the world? So this week on The Big View, we're going to talk about stablecoins. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights about the biggest global stories in business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Tharlarsson. To tackle these questions, I'm delighted to welcome Dan Davies onto the show. Dan is an expert on banks and bank regulation. He worked as a regulatory economist at the Bank of England and as an analyst at several banks in the City of London, covering the financial industry, which is where I first came across his work. He's written extensively about financial scandals and crises and has produced several books, including Lying for Money, which is about financial fraud, and most recently, The Unaccountability Machine, which explores systemic failures. He also maintains an entertaining blog on Substack called Back of Mind. Dan Davies, welcome to The Big View.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, if you talk to crypto enthusiasts, they tell you that stablecoins are totally new things. But you're a sort of a keen observer of financial history, and I think we know that there are very few genuinely new innovations in finance. So, if you look at it from that perspective, how should we think about stablecoins? What should we think about what they are, really?
What they are is what they do. You give them $1, you get a magic number, which kind of denotes your ownership of that dollar. You can then send your magic number around and have its ownership kind of updated on the blockchain. So you can have its ownership of that kind of number in a ledger. And then at some point in the future, someone can take that and turn it back into US dollar. This looks really like deposit business.
Right.
You know, it's got all of the characteristics of what I would call deposit business, which is that you've got a ledger, you've got a transferable deposit, you've got nominal value, and you've got redemption at call. So, in my mind, there is not much justification for calling stablecoins anything different from a bank.
Mm-hmm.
It's an unusual kind of bank because it doesn't make loans and it doesn't do a lot of the other kind of business that banks do. But there are lots of unusual kinds of banks. They cover everything from Danish mortgage banks financed by 30-year bonds to Cantor Fitzgerald financed by overnight money. I don't personally see any reason not to stretch the definition of a bank to cover stablecoin. I know that a lot of people disagree with me, and some of them get really passionate about the subject.
Yes, they do. And there's been this incredibly lively debate in the last few weeks online about whether or not they're banks, and if they're not banks, what are they?
Yeah.
And we can get into that a bit later, and then get some more people to send you some hate mail or kind of insult you on the internet. But maybe just to kick off, I mean, at Breaking Views, we always like to kind of get our head around things by looking at numbers, just to get a sense of the scale of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So I looked up this morning and said Tether, which has been around for just over 10 years, has coins in circulation of about $150 billion.
Yeah.
USDC, which is operated by Circle, is worth $60 billion. And then there's a few other smaller ones. I mean, it's obviously a lot of money, but in the context of deposits held in banks or funds invested in equities or fixed income, it's still pretty small. So is it worth getting worked up about this?
Pretty small, but it's quite restricted in its addressable market for the moment.
Yeah.
So, for example, they've put up those numbers while being basically unavailable to the majority of US citizens. So, most of these things are mainly kind of traded outside the USA. Tether is in the process of being delisted in the European Union, which means you can still own it there, but you can't put it on an exchange and market it to the public because Tether doesn't want to comply with the new European markets in crypto assets regulations. And we can talk about why that is later, because there's some quite interesting issues there. So this is currently a very niche market, almost all of the use of which is either for trading in other crypto assets, so for just being the equivalent of US dollar deposits for the crypto exchanges, which have problems getting money in and out of the banking system, because the other big use for stablecoins is crime.
Yep.
They provide payment services in a way in which it is difficult to implement the normal know your customer and anti-money laundering controls, and in which, in fact, most of them have much weaker AML and KYC, and as a result, they are becoming, I recently saw a report suggesting that stablecoins have now taken majority market share from Bitcoin for international illicit payments.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. I actually remember a blog post you once did, this is a while back now, where you tried to estimate the addressable market for Bitcoin by adding up things like drugs and arms dealing and body parts and various other things. I see. So Bitcoin has competition in the crime business.
And in many ways, it's technologically superior competition, because a lot of the problem of the old illicit online drugs marketplaces, the Silk Roads and whatever, was that they had the classic small business problem of costs in one currency and revenues in another. So they were heavily exposed to forex risk between US dollars, which is what drug producers and wholesalers still want paid in, and Bitcoin, where they were getting their revenues. As it happened, they tended to do quite well out of the carry trade while Bitcoin was going up, but it was always a mismatch there. And so now, if you can receive your revenues in something which has a stable value in US dollars, you're no longer bearing that forex risk. So, for illicit payments, it's greatly superior for that reason.
Yeah, and superior to suitcases full of cash and things like that as well, I imagine. Yeah. So then let's talk about this this legislation, the Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for U.S. Stablecoins Act, or Genius. You see what they did there.
Yeah.
So on the face of it, given what you've just said, you would think that bringing something like this into the regulatory sort of perimeter might be a good thing. I mean, the Genius Act, these stablecoins, they have to provide transparency, they have to regular disclosure, there's audits, they face limits on what they can do with the money that they raise.
Yeah.
They can't pay interest. But
Yeah.
you wrote an essay in the New York Times with Henry Farrell, former guest on The Big View,
Yeah.
saying stablecoins will foster scams and sanctions evasion, generate financial risk, and perhaps even allow another currency to supplant the dollar in global trade. Can you unpack the contradiction between what appears to be additional regulation and what the consequences you're describing?
It's the matter of you're bringing them into the tent. You might analogize it to legalizing gambling.
Right.
While gambling's illegal, it's something that's always going to be a minority pursuit, and everyone involved in it is going to be aware that they are doing something kind of bad and kind of disreputable, that you have to go to a special secret seedy place in order to do it. At the other end of this spectrum, you can have heavily regulated gambling, in which it's now reasonably safe. It's mainstream, but there are limits on how it can be marketed. There are limits on how it can be done, and it can be controlled at a social level. What you don't want to be is in that halfway space, with any kind of activity where it's sufficiently regulated to be brought into the mainstream of legal activity, but where there's no actual control over over what kind of goes on there. In particular, with the Genius Act regime, there are some anti-money laundering and KYC obligations on stablecoin issuers. But the whole point of a stablecoin is that it's a magic number being held on a distributed ledger. There is no subsequent, there is much less subsequent KYC control or anti-money laundering control in terms of how that is transferred and who it's transferred to. Then you've got the fact that there is no effective supervision of stablecoin issuers in their capacity as stablecoin issuers. Some of these issuers will also be banks and will be regulated financial institutions, but their stablecoin provision has only a very light touch of having to show that they've got reserves, usually about 1 month in arrears, and usually have those reserves attested rather than audited. So you've got definite fraud risk. You've got a surprisingly wide variety of assets that they can be invested in. So the kind of dollar backing has to be low risk, but there's plenty of those things which are very much not no risk. And then probably the biggest risk, I would say, to a stablecoin market as it stands is there's almost no control over the actual operational risk of these things. So there is really surprisingly little supervision over whether the upkeep and maintenance of that ledger, which records the ownership of every stablecoin, is actually going to happen in a reliable way. So you've got a lot of risk there. You've got a lot of instability. And by its very nature, a stablecoin is an incredibly run-prone security. Because you should be able to redeem them more or less instantly at 100 cents in the dollar.
Yeah, that's implicit in the name, isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's usually kind of legally guaranteed by the structure. But that means that if you think there's even a small chance that it might be worth 95 cents in the dollar, then you want to get out immediately. And the entire liability structure is all sight deposits, so they are very run prone. And you do get runs of billions of dollars on these things. In the worst kind of episode for Tether, the biggest stablecoin, we were seeing billions of dollars a day going out of that thing. And managing billions of dollars a day worth of runs is logistically very difficult to do. Tether just about managed to do it. There are certainly, some smaller and less reliable stablecoins which I think would be hard pushed to do so. Selling that many treasury bills in any short period of time is going to bring volatility into the treasury market. But even worse is the fact that a lot of these stablecoins are going to have a large part of their reserves in the form of bank deposits.
Right.
So they're going to take your dollar that you provide them in exchange for your magic number, and they might buy 60 cents worth of 30-day treasury bills, and then, because it's much more operationally convenient, deposit 40 cents of your dollar with a money center bank, again, at immediate kind of zero notice withdrawal. That makes these things really bad customers for the banking system. Because if you've got someone who's depositing tens of billions of US at your bank, and they might want 2 billion at the touch, like literally, they might phone you up on Monday morning and say, we had some bad headline news over the weekend. We need 2 billion stat. If you're a small bank, that can immediately put you in liquidity trouble of your own. Interestingly, that's why Tether is ending up being delisted in the European Union, because they have found that big European banks don't want to bank them because they are scared of the LML and operational risks. The European regulations were going to require them to deposit a large amount of their float with European banks. The only banks that were prepared to do that business were small European banks. And so the chief executive of Tether ended up giving an interview, which I thought he made a reasonable point in saying, actually, we don't want to be in a position where if we have another 20% run on our stable coin, we are left effectively knocking over half a dozen small European banks and creating a knock-on situation which might be completely uncontrollable.
Oh wow! So he actually sort of flagged that risk himself.
Yeah, he flagged that risk.
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, I wonder the extent to which he's talking strategically there and hoping that he's going to be able to put a deal with the European authorities and keep the currency in the European market. But he's flagged it up, and whatever happens in the future, that's a real risk which is going to be there. These things are basically intrinsically unstable financial structures. They are, another way of describing them is they're like money market funds minus all of the things which might make you not want to regulate a money market fund as a bank. And they're just being kind of put straight into the heart of the US dollar system, which means that the global use of the US dollar now has to put up with the fact that everyone who's interacting with it is also interacting with a brand new species of extremely unstable entities, some of which have quite questionable connections.
Got it. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess the way you describe it there, it almost makes moot that question of like, are stable coins deposits or are they not? Because if they're collecting money from their users and then putting it in a bank, then you've sort of created, at least at one arm's length, you've created the sort of the deposit risk anyway, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of, partly because it seems to get so bad-tempered, but just on fundamental grounds, I kind of like to get away from this idea of, are they a bank, are they a deposit? Because it's really a philosophical question. The actual interesting thing is, what is their activity and what risks does it raise? And it's those risks which make me think that these things are quite dangerous in return for really surprisingly, there's very few use cases for this that make you think that there's a great benefit from stable coins that couldn't be achieved in some other way.
I just want to just on the sort of the banking question. I don't really want to litigate the whole point about deposits, but there is an aspect of this which again harks back to financial history. And there was in the wake of the Great Depression, when you had the collapse of the large parts of the U.S. banking system, there was this idea called the Chicago Plan, which is that you would create banks which took deposits and only invested them in very safe assets, and that way banks would be safe, and all the lending would happen somewhere else. I guess just philosophically, clearly that's not what's happened here, but would it have been possible, or would it yet be possible to regulate stablecoins in such a way that they became something that looked like that?
Possibly, yeah. I've got actually a lot of sympathy for the people who say that a stablecoin is something like a narrow bank,
Right.
which was the kind of instituting that Friedman was talking about in the Chicago Plan.
Mm.
I think what they've done, though, is that they've showed us just how risky a narrow bank actually is. So stablecoins invest purely in assets with negligible credit risk.
Yeah.
So they're investing in US Treasury bills if they're dollar denominated. They're investing in prime money market deposits. They are meant to invest in things which have low but not zero interest rate risk and small but not zero liquidity risk. The difference between close to zero and actually zero, though, in my view, matters a hell of a lot when you've got something which absolutely has to be redeemed at 100 cents in the dollar, not 99.9 cents in the dollar. Now, and then we have all of the things that economists don't think about when they think about the banking system, because the more prestigious someone's economics degree, the more you can guarantee that they've never settled a ledger in their life. There's a lot that can go wrong with a bank that takes in deposits and invests in risk-free assets. There's just huge amounts of bookkeeping, technology, cyber attacks, being associated with a politician who's just been impeached. That could happen. Being associated with criminality in payments things. There's all sorts of wild things out there that can go wrong in the real economy, which don't necessarily go wrong in a blackboard model. One of my very old first bosses from the Bank of England days was a guy called Lyndon Nelson, who became one of the sort of doyens of bank supervision. He was on the Basel Committee for several years. And he gave a great speech pointing out that operational risk and IT risk is actually much worse than credit risk or liquidity risk from a bank supervisor's point of view, because if you come to the Bank of England on a Friday evening with one of their problems, they can't say, here is the database of last resort. They can't say, here is the cybersecurity solution of last resort. These are actually the kind of problems that a stablecoin or a narrow bank can have. They're probably lower frequency, but they're actually higher severity, because the kind of problems they can get into are exactly the kind of problems that you just can't solve from a central bank's point of view.
Yeah. And that's in the context where we assume that the sort of the kind of structures as they've been designed by this legislation remain more or less as they are. I mean, if you look at this a different way, you could sort of say what essentially, and I think you alluded to this earlier, they've created this legislation creates a sort of category of lightly regulated banks, which could then over time, develop into, and maybe, they stretch a bit further out on the maturity curve in terms of where they're putting their assets, or they do a little bit of lending on the side, or they find some other way to do something that looks like a safe asset, but is actually lending. And we've seen these kind of structures in the past. I mean, before the financial crisis, you had these structured investment vehicles that sort of did stuff like this. It's very easy for those things to morph into something else, right?
Absolutely. And anything that becomes profitable generates a political lobby for being allowed to do more. And the thing about allowing stablecoins specifically into the US dollar market is that as very cheap payment methods, partly cheap because they don't provide the same kind of chargeback services, consumer protections, or AML controls, then you're throwing them into one of the most overpriced payment markets in the world. I think people could be very surprised at the speed at which stablecoins gained market share if they started becoming widely available to US retail.
Yeah.
Just simply because the way that stablecoin transfers work, the pricing isn't directly comparable to debit and credit cards or to bank transfers, but US debit and credit cards and bank transfers are anomalously rich in the developed world. And so you would guess that stablecoins are going to be able to compete very well on pricing terms for all sorts of payments, right down to buying a slice of pizza on a street corner.
Oh, so maybe we will actually be using crypto to buy stuff for once, which has been the holy grail. But just I just want to just talk a bit about the sort of, I mean, you alluded, you mentioned it a few times, the sort of the international context. I mean, and we can talk about the regulation in a minute, but I'm just wondering about the sort of the use cases. I mean, you said we haven't really had a use case for these kind of things beyond sort of crime and money laundering and so forth. I mean, one thing that you can sort of see, and I think this is happening to a certain extent, is that they could be appealing in countries where people don't trust the local currency, right? So I pick a country like Zimbabwe. People have already widely used dollars, and if you can carry dollar-backed stable coins in an app on your phone and pay with them, and don't have to cart around wadges of notes, then that could be quite appealing. I mean, you potentially see. So I wonder whether the sort of the scope here for stablecoins to be a kind of a force for kind of greater dollarization of parts of the international system.
Well, yeah. I think Senator Kirsten Gillibrand said that was her reason for supporting a Republican-backed bill in the Genius bill, that it would be good for international use of the dollar. And you can see situations where people start doing that and the US dollar starts getting used more. But on the other hand, I think it's going to provoke a reaction because most currencies aren't quite as bad as the Zimbabwean dollar. Most currencies, might be more like, I don't know, Vietnamese dong or sort of Malaysian ringgit, where people might want to have US dollar stable coins in their pocket or on their phone, but where the local central bank and the local kind of government isn't necessarily so keen on completely losing the ability to carry out monetary policy in their domestic economy. And obviously the big issue there is Eurozone, because it's definitely visible from public statements from the European Central Bank that they are not keen on stable coins, precisely because they don't want to see a private sector US dollar set of payment solutions being widely used for transactions anywhere in their backyard. They think that would be quite obviously a big blow to European strategic autonomy, and for that reason their big kind of stable coin killer is the digital euro, which is something which is just basically electronic payments in euro, giving cash-like kind of characteristics, but working across the payment rails of the European Central Bank, and obviously having the kind of nice property that they can't fail. There's no way that an electronic currency provided by the European Central Bank in euros can run out of euros. That's just not a thing that can happen.
That's interesting. So is the sort of the competition there? Is it sort of you can regulate to stop dollar-based stablecoins from coming in, or is it you have to sort of provide a more credible or a more sort of workable alternative, or both?
They've been both. They've essentially got a pretty well-developed structure for stablecoins. Tether don't like it, but it's there. And if anyone can find a big European bank who's prepared to partner with them, that means they might not be able to do all of the things that many stablecoin promoters want to do. But if you can do that, then you can set up very easily in Europe as a stablecoin. You can set up with an e-money license, and you can do all those things. Europe's intrinsically not all that stablecoin hostile. Their big defense mechanism is to say, why would you do this when, firstly, your debit card works really quickly and really cheaply in the single European payments area because we've got regulated bank fees and really nice payment rails. And if you're really concerned about anonymous payments, then the latest design of the digital euro will make you do transactions up to 3,000 euros offline in a way that is anonymous and can't be traced to you. And as we all know, the reason why they want that offline payment functionality is that someone might be hiking in the Alps out of range of wireless signal. That's definitely what that offline transaction is for. Any suggestions otherwise would be scurrilous.
So, yes, because I guess that sort of, maybe this is the way to kind of wrap this up, is from a regulatory point of view. The regulators in other countries are going to have to respond to what's happened in the US, right? Yeah. I mean, I had the person who's responsible for financial stability at one major central bank used the analogy of social media, sort of, that this was something which was kind of being allowed to grow and to spread, and without really much thought about the consequences, and if it wasn't capped or limited in some way, we would find ourselves in a situation where we couldn't really put the genie back in the bottle. So how do you expect the rest of the world to sort of respond to this then?
Well, I think that one way the rest of the world has responded is that central bank digital currencies are allowing much more anonymity in their design documents. I've tracked kind of iterations of the design documents for the digital euro, to a lesser extent the digital yuan. And in the early days, it was considered to be a feature that these digital currencies would have complete traceability, and that everything would be trackable and there would be no more anonymous payments through cash. Everyone guessed that this, all of the market research reveals that people want to be able to make anonymous payments. People want same cash-like privacy. The fact that the USA has now dumped stablecoins into the mix, where stablecoins can give you really good, not quite cash-like privacy, but much better privacy than bank transfers, means that all of the central bank digital currencies are going to have to step up to that. And I think is very noticeable, particularly in the European context. And I think we're due another design document on the digital pound sterling soon. All of those things are going to have to get to grips with the fact that for electronic payments, people like having the option of cash-like privacy. And so although the regulators might have liked the idea of complete traceability, they're now kind of realizing that in a world in which stablecoins are not only possible, but endorsed by the US government, you've got to compromise with the wider, with the consumer.
Right. So this sort of comes back to that question of I quoted that line from your article at the beginning about how this might be bad for the US dollar, because on the face of it, you would think, well, this is sort of technology that might spread adoption of the US dollar. But I guess what you're saying is the reaction to that ease of spread will ultimately work against the dollar.
Absolutely. And this is a wider project that myself and Henry Farrell are working on at the moment. You're then throwing that into an environment in which there's a lot of other reasons why other countries might be trying to build back their autonomy and reduce their initial reliance on being connected to the US dollar payments network. It's we were already thinking that, in the Trump era, it's going to be more and more attractive to people to be less dependent on using the US dollar and therefore subjecting half of your economy to the jurisdiction of US courts. When you've now also signing up to the US dollar means signing up to stablecoins, it's just another reason to start looking for alternatives and looking for ways to reduce your economic dependence on the United States of America.
That's really fascinating. That is a really interesting question. Unfortunately, it's a question we may have to come back to on another episode because I think we're more or less out of time. But Dan, this has been really fascinating. Thank you very much for coming and walking us through all this. And I hope you don't get too much abuse on the internet as a result of this conversation.
Always happy to talk to crypto fans. Oh, there's some very interesting people out there. Thanks ever so much for inviting me on.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for this week. Thanks to Dan for that fascinating discussion. And as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favourite platform. And don't forget to check out our sister podcast, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team, Reuters World News, your daily dose of the biggest global stories, and Reuters Econ World, a weekly deep dive into an economic concept behind the headlines. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.